The sun had just risen, its light filtering through the rows of trees along the small path where Kofi was riding his bicycle to school. He always loved the mornings. The fresh air calmed his mind before a long day of studying. Kofi's dark, bright eyes sparkled, reflecting the innocence and intelligence of a 14-year-old boy. His old bicycle, a birthday gift from his mother, was his most treasured possession. The streets were still quiet as Kofi turned onto a secluded corner, a place rarely frequented by others. Suddenly, the sound of a police car siren echoed behind him. Kofi turned his head and saw a police car approaching. His heart raced slightly, unsure of what was happening. The car screeched to a halt right next to him. A man in uniform stepped out. The officer, Jason Brooks, was tall, his face cold and his eyes filled with suspicion. Jason looked at Kofi as if the boy had just committed a crime. "Stop right there," Jason yelled, his voice full of authority. "What are you doing here?" Kofi stammered, his voice trembling. I'm just on my way to school." Jason stepped closer, his sharp gaze cutting like a knife. "This bike yours? You look like you just stole it from somewhere. Got any proof?" Kofi was bewildered. "Proof? This is my bike. My parents bought it for me." Jason didn't believe him. He grabbed Kofi's arm and yanked him off the bike. Kofi cried out in pain, but Jason didn't stop. He rummaged through Kofi's school bag, tossing all his books onto the ground. Passers-by began to gather, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. "Look at you," Jason sneered. "A black kid riding a nice bike like this? You think I'm stupid?" Kofi hung his head, unable to speak, tears threatening to spill. The ordeal lasted only a few minutes, but to Kofi, felt like a nightmare. Onlookers murmured among themselves, some voicing objections, but Jason waved them off dismissively. Finally, Jason walked away, leaving Kofi sitting on the ground, clutching the bruise on his arm. Kofi returned home with red, teary eyes and a troubled heart. He didn't dare tell his parents because he didn't want to worry them. But the bruise on his arm and the fear in his eyes couldn't hide the truth. His mother, Amara, immediately noticed something was wrong. "Kofi, what happened to you?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Kofi shook his head. "It's nothing, Mom. I just fell off my bike." But that night, when the entire house was asleep, Kofi couldn't close his eyes. He kept replaying the memory of Jason's contemptuous gaze and the humiliating words that had pierced his heart. This wasn't the first time he had faced discrimination. In Kofi's memory, he recalled being turned away from a toy store because the clerk thought he couldn't afford anything, or the time his classmates mocked him just because of the color of his skin. Those wounds didn't show on his body, but they were etched deeply into the mind of a growing boy. While Kofi was trying to forget the heartbreaking experience from the previous day, the world around him was erupting because of it. Early in the morning, a neighbor knocked on Kofi's door with a worried expression. In his hand was a phone playing a video. The footage was none other than the scene of Kofi being humiliated by Jason on the street. Kofi's mother, Amara, didn't understand what was going on at first, but when she saw the part where Jason shoved Kofi forcefully, the pain in her heart flared into anger. "Who recorded this video?" she asked, her voice trembling. The neighbor shook his head. "I don't know, but this video is spreading like wildfire on social media. The entire neighborhood is talking about it." At that moment, Kofi stepped out of his room, his eyes reflecting worry as he saw his mother looking at him with deep concern. He had kept the incident to himself, not wanting to upset his family. But now, the situation had spiraled out of control. As Kofi sat silently, across the city, social media keyboards were in a frenzy. Users flooded the comments under the video. "I can't believe a cop would treat a child like this. This is clear evidence of racial discrimination in our system. This boy needs protection, and that officer needs to be held accountable." Major human rights organizations, like the Council for Justice and the Anti-Racism Alliance, quickly stepped in. They shared the video alongside powerful calls for justice for Kofi. Journalists published articles, and interviews with witnesses from the scene started making the rounds. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense, like a tightly wound string. Police Chief Robert Wilson, a middle-aged man with a sharp demeanor, watched the video on his phone over and over. He knew the situation was grave and that mishandling it could severely damage the department's reputation. He summoned Jason Brooks to his office immediately. "Jason," Robert said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Have you seen what's happening online?" Jason looked annoyed. "It's just a video, sir. People like to blow things out of proportion." Robert set the phone down on his desk, his gaze piercing. "No, this isn't just a video. This is evidence of misconduct, and public outrage is boiling over. If we don't act, things will only get worse." Jason shrugged but felt a growing unease inside, though he wouldn't admit it. He knew this video could ruin his career. Still, he tried to justify himself. "I was just following procedure, you know." The kid looked really suspicious, but Robert shook his head. "I don't care about your excuses. This is a crisis, and if you're not careful, it's going to become your crisis." In a luxurious office far from the city center, Foreign Minister Marcus Iadil sat pensively in front of his computer screen. His assistant had just sent him a link to the video that was causing a storm on social media. Marcus couldn't believe his eyes when he realized that the child in the video was none other than Kofi, his son. Marcus's heart sank. He replayed the video over and over, scrutinizing every detail, every action. Jason's insults cut through him like a knife. As a man of power, Marcus was accustomed to handling tense situations. But at this moment, he was just a helpless father, grappling with the pain inflicted upon his child. Marcus stood up and stepped out of his office. He called his trusted assistant, instructing them to immediately investigate the identity of the police officer in the video. Within a few hours, the report was in. Jason Brooks, 38 years old, with over 15 years of service in the police force. Marcus also learned that Jason had a history of misconduct in cases involving people of color, but he had always managed to avoid consequences thanks to protection from his superiors. Marcus clenched his fists. He knew he couldn't publicly reveal Kofi's identity. Not yet. As foreign minister, he had always shielded his family from the prying eyes of the media. But this time, things were different. That evening, Marcus made a call to the mayor. The conversation lasted over an hour but concluded with Marcus's firm declaration: "I want a formal investigation, and I won't let this be swept under the rug." Meanwhile, Jason remained oblivious to the fact that the boy he had humiliated was the son of one of the most powerful men in the country. He was confident that, as in previous incidents, the situation would blow over. But Jason had no idea that the real storm was yet to come. Marcus spent the entire night thinking about how to protect Kofi. He glanced at the family photo on his desk, where Kofi was beaming brightly beside his parents. Marcus vowed that he would not let anyone hurt his son again. Marcus Iadil's office was unusually quiet that afternoon, yet the silence was deafening. He had just ended a tense call with the mayor, who, despite being cooperative on the surface, seemed reluctant to take decisive action against Jason Brooks. Marcus knew this reluctance stemmed from the tangled politics surrounding law enforcement, where accountability often took a backseat to image management. However, Marcus was determined not to let this matter fade into obscurity. He called for his trusted chief of staff, Evelyn Karunja, a sharp and resolute woman who had been with him for over a decade. Evelyn entered the room, clipboard in hand, her face reflecting the same steely resolve as Marcus. "We need leverage," Marcus said, pacing the room. "The mayor is stalling, and the police chief is no better. They're hoping this storm will pass." Evelyn nodded. "I've already reached out to several advocacy groups. The video has given them a solid case to push for accountability. But we need more than public outcry. We need undeniable pressure." Marcus paused. "What about Brooks? Does he know who Kofi is?" Evelyn hesitated, Not yet. He still thinks Kofi is just another kid from the neighborhood. But Marcus, if we reveal Kofi's identity, could escalate quickly. Are you sure that's what we want? Marcus sighed, his hand running through his neatly cropped hair. I don't want Kofi's name dragged into this. He's been through enough. But if it's the only way to ensure justice, then so be it. Later that evening, Marcus arranged a private meeting with Jason Brooks. The meeting took place in a small conference room at City Hall. Jason entered the room, his demeanor cocky, his uniform impeccably pressed. He was under the impression that this was a routine inquiry meant to placate public outrage. Marcus, dressed in a tailored navy suit, exuded calm authority as he stood at the head of the table. Officer Brooks, he began, his tone measured. Do you know who I am? Jason looked at him, puzzled. Yes, sir. You're the Secretary of State. Do you know why you're here? Marcus continued, folding his hands on the table. Jason shrugged. I assume it's about that video. Look, Mr. Iadil, I was just doing my job. That kid looked suspicious, and I followed protocol. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. That kid, Officer Brooks, is my son. Jason froze, his face turning pale. Your son? Yes, my son, Marcus said, his voice now laced with cold anger. And I have spent my entire career fighting for justice and equality. Yet here I am, watching my child become a victim of the very system I've been trying to reform. Jason stammered. I didn't know. I swear. I didn't mean. Marcus cut him off. Save your excuses. The video speaks for itself. You abused your power, humiliated a child, and perpetuated a cycle of hatred and prejudice. And now, you will face the consequences. Jason left the meeting visibly shaken. For the first time, he realized that his actions had real, far-reaching implications. Jason Brooks drove home that night in silence. The radio, usually blaring country music, was off. The weight of Marcus Iadil's words pressed heavily on his chest. As he turned onto his quiet suburban street, his mind began to drift back to his childhood. Jason grew up in a small, predominantly white town. His father, a retired police officer, had been a stern, no-nonsense man who believed in strict discipline. Jason idolized him, but his father's worldview was shaped by years of seeing the worst in people, and he often spoke in generalizations that bordered on prejudice. People like them don't belong here. His father would say over dinner. Jason never questioned it. To him, his father's words were gospel. After joining the police force, Jason quickly realized that his father's attitude was common among many of his colleagues. Over time, those biases became second nature to him. He didn't see himself as a bad person, just someone doing his job. But now, as he sat in his car outside his house, Jason couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he had crossed a line. For the first time, he wondered if everything he'd been taught was wrong. At the Iadil household, Kofi was struggling. The events of that fateful morning replayed in his mind like a broken record. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jason's face stern, angry, and unyielding. He heard the taunts, the accusations, and felt the searing shame of being humiliated in public. Kofi, sweetheart, are you all right? His mother asked gently as she knocked on his bedroom door. Kofi hesitated before replying. I'm fine, Mom. But he wasn't. He couldn't shake the fear that gripped him every time he stepped outside. Even the once simple act of riding his bike now felt like a daunting challenge. That night, he dreamed of being chased. In his dream, Jason was not a man but a towering shadow. Faceless and menacing, Kofi ran. But no matter how fast he went, the shadow always loomed closer. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He wanted to tell his parents, but something held him back. He didn't want to burden them, especially knowing how much his father was already dealing with. The next morning, Amara noticed the dark circles under Kofi's eyes. She decided it was time to take action. She called a family therapist who specialized in trauma. "We need to help him before this fear consumes him," she told Marcus. Marcus nodded, his face etched with worry. "We will," he promised. "We'll get through this together." The community was in uproar. Protests erupted outside the police department, with hundreds of people chanting, "Justice for Kofi." Signs bearing phrases like, "End police brutality," and "Black Lives Matter" filled the air. Local news stations covered the protests extensively. Interviews with community leaders and activists painted a grim picture of systemic racism within the police force. At City Hall, the mayor and police chief Robert Wilson were under immense pressure. Emails and phone calls flooded their offices, demanding accountability. Advocacy groups threatened to escalate the matter to the national level if immediate action wasn't taken. Inside the Ideal household, the family watched the protests on TV. Kofi felt a mix of emotions. He was grateful for the support, but he also felt overwhelmed by the attention. "Why are they doing this for me?" he asked his mother one evening. Amara knelt beside him. "Because what happened to you was wrong, Kofi. And it's not just about you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her words stayed with Kofi. Slowly, he began to realize that his story had the power to spark change. It wasn't just about his pain, it was about ensuring a better future for others like him. At the heart of the city's police headquarters, a small conference room buzzed with tension. The Internal Affairs Unit had been tasked with investigating Jason Brooks' actions. A panel of senior officers, lawyers, and community representatives sat at a long table. Video footage, witness statements, and public outcry formed a mountain of evidence too large to ignore. Detective Clara Nguyen, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator, led the inquiry. Known for her integrity, Clara was determined to get to the truth. She began by interviewing Jason. He sat stiffly in his chair, his badge clipped to his uniform, though he had been temporarily suspended from active duty. "You understand why you're here, Officer Brooks?" Clara asked, her voice calm but firm. "Yes," Jason muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Let's start from the beginning. Why did you stop Kofi Ideal that morning?" Jason hesitated. He looked suspicious. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? How exactly?" Jason fumbled for words. He was riding a bike that seemed too expensive for a kid like him." Clara leaned forward. "So, you assumed he stole it?" Jason shifted uncomfortably. "I was doing my job." "Your job," Clara repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. "Your job involves protecting and serving, not harassing and humiliating a child based on assumptions." As the questioning continued, Jason's confidence crumbled. The weight of the evidence against him became impossible to deny. Witnesses corroborated Kofi's account, and the video left no room for interpretation. The panel adjourned the session, but Jason knew his career and possibly his freedom hung by a thread. Meanwhile, the investigation extended beyond Jason. Internal Affairs discovered a pattern of complaints against him, many of which had been buried or dismissed. This revelation shook the department to its core, forcing senior officers to confront the systemic issues they had long ignored. As the investigation progressed, Marcus Ideal found himself in a moral dilemma. While he wanted justice for Kofi, he also struggled with the implications of using his political influence. The last thing he wanted was for people to accuse him of leveraging his position for personal gain. However, he knew that without pressure, the system might fail to deliver justice. One evening, Marcus met with Evelyn to discuss their next steps. "We have enough evidence to ensure Jason is held accountable," Evelyn said, sliding a folder across the desk. "But the real question is, what do we want to achieve beyond that?" Marcus opened the folder, scanning its contents. "Change," he said firmly. "This isn't just about Jason. It's about dismantling the biases that allow people like him to thrive in positions of power." Evelyn nodded. "Then we need to go public. Share Kofi's story, but on our terms." Later that week, Marcus held a press conference. He stood behind a podium, flanked by Amara and Kofi. The room was packed with journalists, their cameras and microphones trained on the family. My son, Kofi, was a victim of racial profiling and police misconduct. Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This is not an isolated incident. It reflects a deeper, systemic problem that must be addressed. Kofi stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone. I was scared, he said softly, his voice cracking. But I don't want anyone else to feel that way. We need change. The press conference sent shockwaves through the city. Public support for the ideal family grew, and calls for police reform intensified. Jason's suspension was soon followed by a formal indictment. He faced charges of misconduct, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights. The trial became a media spectacle, with every development scrutinized by the public. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily, their chants echoing through the city streets. Signs demanding justice for Kofi and end police brutality filled the air. Inside, the courtroom was a battleground between the prosecution, who presented damning evidence, and the defense, who argued that Jason's actions were misinterpreted. Kofi was called to testify. As he took the stand, he felt the weight of 100 eyes on him. He recounted the events of that morning with clarity, his voice steady despite the emotional toll. I didn't do anything wrong, Kofi said, looking directly at Jason. But he made me feel like I was a criminal just because of how I look. Jason avoided Kofi's gaze, his expression a mix of guilt and shame. The defense attempted to paint Jason as a dedicated officer who made a mistake under pressure. But the prosecution dismantled this narrative, highlighting Jason's history of bias and misconduct. The jury listened intently, their expressions grave. Outside the courtroom, public opinion grew more divided. While many supported Kofi, a vocal minority defended Jason, arguing that the scrutiny he faced was unfair. The debate spilled over into social media, talk shows, and community meetings, reflecting the broader tensions surrounding race and policing. As the trial continued, Kofi began to find strength in his role as an advocate for change. He joined forces with local youth organizations, speaking at events and sharing his story. Each time he stood before a crowd, his confidence grew. One evening, Kofi attended a rally organized by a civil rights group. Hundreds of people gathered in a park, holding candles and chanting for justice. When it was his turn to speak, Kofi stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding. Thank you for being here, he began, his voice amplified by the microphone. What happened to me wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that allows people to judge others based on their skin color. The crowd erupted in applause. Kofi continued, we can't let fear divide us. We need to stand together and demand better for ourselves, for our families, and for the future. After the rally, Kofi was approached by a young boy who looked up at him with wide eyes. You're really brave, the boy said. I want to be like you when I grow up. Kofi smiled, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a victim, he was a voice for change. While the trial gained momentum, Jason Brooks's personal life began to unravel. His wife, Lauren, who had been his steadfast supporter for years, struggled to reconcile the man she loved with the actions exposed in the courtroom. Their suburban home, once a place of comfort, now echoed with tension and silence. One evening, after putting their 8-year-old daughter Emily to bed, Lauren confronted Jason in the kitchen. He sat at the table, staring blankly at the newspaper, which bore a front-page story about the trial. Jason, Lauren said softly, breaking the silence. I need to know the truth. Did you really do everything they're saying? Jason sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. I don't know, Lauren. I thought I was doing my job. But now, I'm not so sure. Lauren's voice trembled. How could you? That was a child. Jason, a child. And now everyone knows. Emily's teachers, our neighbors, they're all looking at us differently. Jason looked up at her, his eyes hollow. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But it did. Lauren snapped, her frustration boiling over. And now our family is falling apart because of it. Their argument escalated until Lauren stormed out of the room, tears streaming down her face. Jason was left alone, grappling with the consequences of his actions. He realized that his choices had not only harmed Kofi but had also torn apart his own family. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the day of closing arguments. Spectators filled every seat, while reporters stood in the back, scribbling notes and whispering updates into their phones. The air buzzed with anticipation as the prosecution and defense prepared to make their final statements. The prosecutor, a formidable woman named Rachel Carter, stepped forward first. Her voice was calm but forceful as she addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about accountability. She began. Officer Jason Brooks had a duty to protect and serve, but instead, he abused his power. He humiliated a child and violated his civil rights based on nothing more than a baseless assumption. Rachel gestured toward the evidence table. Where the video footage and a stack of witness statements Saturday, you've seen the proof. You've heard the testimony. Kofi Ayodele did nothing wrong. Yet he was treated as a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. This isn't just about one boy or one officer. It's about standing up against a system that allows such injustice to persist. The defense attorney, Daniel Pratt, took the floor next. He played to the jury's emotions, painting Jason as a hard-working officer who had made an unfortunate mistake. Jason Brooks has served this city for over 15 years. Daniel said, he's not perfect, but who among us is? He made a split-second decision, one that he deeply regrets. Does he deserve to lose everything for one moment of poor judgment? The jury deliberated for hours, and the city held its breath, awaiting the verdict. Outside the courthouse, protesters and supporters alike gathered, their chants filling the air. The jury returned to the courtroom late in the evening, their faces solemn as they filed into their seats. Everyone in the room leaned forward, their attention riveted on the foreperson as she stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Brooks, guilty of misconduct and violation of civil rights. A collective gasp swept through the room. Kofi, sitting with his parents, felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain he had endured. Jason lowered his head, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the soft murmurs of reporters typing furiously on their laptops. As the judge prepared to announce Jason's sentence, Marcus Ayodele stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, may I speak? The judge hesitated before nodding. Proceed. Marcus turned to face Jason. Officer Brooks, your actions caused my son tremendous pain, but I don't believe that vengeance is the answer. What we need is understanding and change. He looked around the courtroom, his voice steady. I ask that instead of a harsh sentence, this court mandates education. Officer Brooks should be required to attend anti-bias training and community service in the neighborhoods he once policed. Let him learn from the people he's wronged. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and even Jason looked surprised. The judge considered Marcus's request carefully before delivering her decision. Jason was sentenced to probation, mandatory training, and 500 hours of community service. Jason's sentence marked the beginning of a long road to redemption. He attended weekly anti-bias training sessions, where he was forced to confront the prejudices he had carried for most of his life. The sessions were uncomfortable and humbling, but they planted the seeds of self-awareness. As part of his community service, Jason worked with youth organizations in predominantly Black neighborhoods. First, he faced skepticism and hostility, but over time, he began to see the humanity in the people he had once viewed through a lens of suspicion. One day, Jason found himself at a community center, speaking to a group of teenagers about his experiences. He admitted his mistakes and urged them to never let anyone define their worth. "I was wrong," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "and I'm here to make things right, even if it takes the rest of my life." Meanwhile, Kofi's life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. He continued to speak out at rallies and events, his confidence growing with each passing day. He became a symbol of resilience and hope, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. The ideal family found solace in their shared strength. Though the scars of the incident remained, they refused to let it define them. Together, they worked to create a future where no child would have to endure what Kofi had experienced. In the end, the story of Kofi and Jason became a catalyst for change, sparking reforms within the police department and fostering conversations about race and equity across the city. It was a testament to the power of truth, compassion, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Months had passed since the trial, but its effects lingered in the lives of everyone involved. The ideal family had begun to heal, yet Kofi still carried the emotional weight of his experience. His nightmares had lessened, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Each time he stepped out into the world, a small part of him braced for hostility. At the same time, Jason Brooks was navigating a new life defined by reflection and penance. His community service brought him face to face with people he had previously dismissed or misunderstood. Every interaction was an education, a lesson in humility that slowly chipped away at the biases he had harbored for so long. One day, Jason was scheduled to speak at a forum on racial equity organized by a local civil rights group. The event aimed to foster dialogue between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Marcus Iadil was one of the keynote speakers, and Kofi had reluctantly agreed to attend. The forum was held in a modest auditorium, packed with people eager to see what would unfold. Jason arrived early, his uniform replaced by simple civilian attire. He felt out of place but determined to face whatever came his way. When it was Jason's turn to speak, he stepped onto the stage with visible apprehension. He looked out at the audience, his eyes landing briefly on Kofi and Marcus in the front row. "My name is Jason Brooks," he began, his voice unsteady. "I used to be a police officer, and I'm here today because I failed." The room was silent as Jason recounted his journey, his upbringing, the prejudices he had absorbed, and the actions that had brought him to this point. He didn't shy away from the truth, even when it made him uncomfortable. "I hurt people," Jason admitted, his voice breaking, "and I can never undo the harm I caused. But I'm here because I want to do better. I need to do better." When he finished, the audience erupted into applause, not because they forgave him entirely, but because they recognized the courage it took to stand there and admit his faults. For the first time in months, Jason felt a glimmer of hope. The forum sparked conversations that extended far beyond the auditorium. Inspired by the event, the city council began drafting reforms aimed at addressing systemic issues within the police department. These reforms included mandatory anti-bias training, the creation of civilian oversight committees, and stricter accountability measures for officers who violated protocol. Marcus Iadil played a pivotal role in these discussions. His position as Secretary of State lent weight to his advocacy, but it was his personal connection to the issue that resonated most deeply. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the reforms weren't just symbolic but substantive and lasting. Kofi, too, became an active participant in the movement. He attended council meetings, sharing his story and advocating for policies that would protect others from experiencing what he had endured. His presence was a reminder that the fight for justice was not abstract but deeply personal. The reforms faced resistance, particularly from factions within the police department who viewed them as an attack on their authority. Police unions staged protests, arguing that the measures were unfair and demoralizing. But the momentum for change was too strong to be derailed. One evening, after a particularly contentious council meeting, Marcus and Kofi sat together in their living room. The The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the television, which played footage of the day's events. "You did well today," Marcus said, breaking the silence. Kofi looked at his father, his expression contemplative. "Do you think it'll actually change anything?" Marcus placed a hand on Kofi's shoulder. "Change is slow, son, but every step forward matters, and you're part of something bigger than yourself." Kofi nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't want anyone else to feel the way he had felt that day on the street. And if sharing his story could make even a small difference, it was worth it. As part of his community service, Jason volunteered at a youth mentorship program in one of the city's underserved neighborhoods. The program provided academic support, career guidance, and a safe space for young people to express themselves. One afternoon, while helping a group of teens with a community project, Jason spotted a familiar face. Kofi was standing at the edge of the basketball court, watching the activity unfold. Jason froze, unsure of what to do. Kofi noticed him and approached cautiously. There was no anger in his eyes, only curiosity. "What are you doing here?" Kofi asked, his tone neutral. Jason cleared his throat. "I'm volunteering, part of my community service." Kofi nodded, studying Jason's face. He could see the weariness in the man's eyes, the lines of guilt etched into his features. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "I'm not here to make excuses," Jason said finally. I want to do something good for once." Kofi considered his words, then extended a hand. Jason hesitated before shaking it, the gesture small but monumental. From that day forward, the two began to interact more frequently. Their conversations were tentative at first, but over time, they grew more open. Jason listened as Kofi shared his experiences, while Kofi began to see Jason as a flawed human being rather than the faceless figure who had wronged him. The city was different now. Though not perfect, the reforms had been implemented, and while they didn't solve every problem, they marked a significant step toward progress. The conversations sparked by Kofi's story continued to ripple through schools, workplaces, and communities. Kofi had become a symbol of resilience and hope, his name recognized far beyond the city limits. He received invitations to speak at conferences and events, sharing his journey and advocating for justice. But despite his growing influence, Kofi remained grounded, always returning to the family and community that had supported him. One crisp autumn morning, Kofi stood at the podium of a packed auditorium. Jason Brooks sat in the audience, alongside Marcus and Amara. The event was a celebration of the community's progress, a moment to reflect on how far they had come. "This isn't just my story," Kofi said, his voice clear and strong. "It's our story. It's about all of us choosing to see each other not as threats or enemies but as people." The audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Kofi looked out at the sea of faces, his heart swelling with gratitude and hope. As the event ended, Jason approached Kofi. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "So have you," Kofi replied with a small smile. They shook hands again, this time as equals. It wasn't forgiveness that defined their interaction but understanding, a shared commitment to building a better future. And so, the story of Kofi and Jason became a testament to the power of empathy, accountability, and the enduring human capacity for change. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a new beginning, one filled with promise and possibility.